In September 16, 1943, 1:00 p.m. to 12 F4U Corsairs banked hard over southern Bougainville and dove straight into 40 Japanese Zeros. The pilots had met 4 days ago. 3 had fewer than 10 combat hours. Half were rejects from disbanded units. None had trained together. Now they faced the most experienced fighter force in the Pacific, outnumbered more than 3-1 in a battle that would decide whether thousands of Marines below lived or died. Then a burst tore through Corsair number 7. Smoke choked the cockpit. Over the radio came a gasp raw, terrified a man's voice breaking as he realized the sky was about to kill him, realizing he might not make it home. This was VMF 214, the Black Sheep. The squadron built from men no one wanted, led by a commander. No one trusted a brilliant tactician with a drinking problem, gambling debts, and a service record thick with fights and failures. They weren't supposed to survive the week, and somehow they were about to terrorize Japan and rewrite Pacific air combat forever. What kind of leader forges legends from the men the military has already given up on? In 1943, the Solomon Islands were a graveyard dressed in green. Jungles swallowed men whole. Monsoons turned runways into mud. Malaria killed as efficiently as bullets. Death came from the sky or the fever, sometimes both on the same day. At the northern edge of this hell sat Rabaul, Japan's aerial fortress. More than 400 aircraft crammed into a single airbase complex. Veteran pilots who'd been killing Americans since Pearl Harbor. This was the stronghold that controlled everything from New Guinea to Guadalcanal, a dagger pointed at every Allied advance in the Pacific. And above it all, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero reigned absolute. Fast, agile, flown by men who'd perfected their craft over China, then the Philippines, then 100 nameless islands where American pilots learned too late what a turning fight with a Zero actually meant. Fire, spin, ocean. The F4U Corsair was supposed to change that. 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. 2,000 horsepower that made the airframe vibrate like it wanted to tear itself apart. Top speed over 400 miles per hour. 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, enough firepower to disintegrate a Zero in 2 seconds of concentrated fire. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a killer. Long nose blocked forward visibility during landing. Pilots couldn't see the carrier deck until the moment before touchdown, fatal at sea. Stiff controls at low speed turned dogfights into death traps. Oil leaks, hydraulic failures, engine fires on takeoff that turned runways into funeral pyres. The Navy took one look and rejected it outright, so the Corps got it instead. Machines for misfits. In September 1943, Marine Command scraped together VMF 214 from the bottom of the barrel. Pilots without squadrons, replacements nobody wanted. Men pulled from stateside training units before they were ready. Reassignments from outfits that had been destroyed or rotated home in pieces. No shared doctrine, no formation discipline, no unified training. No time to build the trust that keeps men alive when the Zeros come. Just strangers in a tent waiting for orders. They needed a commander who could turn chaos into something resembling a fighting unit. They got Gregory Boyington, 30 years old, looked 50, face like weathered leather, eyes that had seen too much and forgiven nothing least of all himself. Former Flying Tiger, fought in China with the American Volunteer Group before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. Brilliant in the cockpit, instinctive, aggressive, the kind of pilot who saw solutions in split seconds that other men needed minutes to calculate. Also, gambling debts that followed him across the Pacific, chronic alcohol use that got worse after every loss. Fistfights with superior officers who questioned his methods, a service record so thick with reprimands and disciplinary actions that most commands wouldn't touch him. But the Marine Corps was desperate. And Boyington had one thing no other available commander possessed. He understood outcasts because he was one. His nickname was Pappy, partly because at 30 he was ancient compared to 19-year-old pilots fresh from flight school, partly because of the way he looked after men who had nowhere else to go, the way a father protects sons even while falling apart himself. The Corps gave him 6 weeks to turn strangers into a combat squadron capable of engaging the best pilots Japan had. Rabaul gave him less. The Black Sheep were being thrown directly into the Rabaul Air Campaign, the most brutal, unforgiving aerial meat grinder of the Pacific War. Japanese air superiority was total. American losses were catastrophic. Squadrons were being chewed up and spit out in weeks. VMF 218 was expected to escort bombers through that hell-engaged superior numbers and somehow survive long enough to matter. Nobody expected them to become legends. Most bets were on how many days they'd last before being wiped out completely. The first mission was supposed to be simple: 12 Corsairs, escort bombers over Kahili Airfield, stay in formation, bring everyone home. 8 minutes in zeros hit them like a sledgehammer. The formation shattered instantly. 2 pilots lost visual contact in the blinding sun glare. Another overshot his wingman during the evasive turn and nearly collided mid-air, missing death by 3 feet. Radios exploded with panic call signs overlapping directions, contradicting voices climbing octaves as tracers streaked past canopies. Japanese fighters slashed through the chaos, hammering the bombers with 20mm cannon fire that punched holes the size of basketballs through aluminum. They limped home. 1 Corsair trailing black smoke. 1 bomber crew dead before they hit the water. Boyington gathered them that night in the operations tent. Rain drummed on canvas. No one spoke. He didn't give a speech, didn't offer comfort, just stated the arithmetic fly like that again, and Christmas would come without them. The second mission went worse. Monsoon walls rose like black mountains, towering thunderheads, climbing to 40,000 feet, swallowing entire flights whole. Inside those clouds, instruments spun uselessly. Radios drowned in static. Up became down. Horizon disappeared. 3 pilots got separated, chased by Zeros through storm darkness, where you couldn't see your own wingtip, much less the enemy on your tail. 1 made it back, shaking, white-faced, unable to speak for an hour. 2 didn't. No wreckage found, no radio calls, just gone erased from existence somewhere between cloud and ocean. Every mission brought fresh nightmares. Engines overheated mid-climb. The R-2800 was a beast in short bursts, but sustained combat power in tropical heat pushed temperatures into the red. Pilots watched gauges climb 200 degrees, 220, 240, knowing that any second the engine could seize, and a dead engine at 20,000 feet over enemy territory meant one thing: falling. They had to choose every time: push full throttle and risk catastrophic failure, or throttle back and watch Zeros close the gap, their guns growing larger in the rearview mirror. Gun jams became routine horror. Moisture from the humid Pacific air condensed inside .50 caliber mechanisms. Altitude changes caused metal to contract. Hard maneuvering shook ammunition belts loose. The Brownings were devastating when they worked, but when 1 gun jammed in a 6-gun array during a crucial moment, pilots squeezed triggers and got nothing. Click, 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 while Zeros kept coming. Hydraulic systems failed without warning. Steering locked mid-turn, forcing pilots to muscle unresponsive controls with both hands, while enemies maneuvered freely. Flaps refused to deploy turning landings into high-speed gambles. Landing gear stuck halfway neither up nor down, creating drag that made the Corsair a flying brick. Pilots nursed crippled aircraft back to Turtle Bay on Espiritu Santo, praying the single runway would be long enough, knowing that if they misjudged by 50 feet, they'd cartwheel into jungle and burn. Then the losses mounted like a bill coming due. An empty bunk. Jenkins's leather jacket still hanging on the tent pole, no one with the heart to move it. A personal effects bag sealed and tagged for shipment home to a mother who'd never understand how her son died. A folded flag handed to a chaplain who'd never met the dead man but had to write the letter anyway. A funeral in the rain while the next mission launched overhead because the war didn't pause for grief, didn't slow for trauma, didn't care that boys were breaking under the weight. The names piled up like a ledger no accountant wanted to balance. Jenkins, Matheson, Cross, Riley, Kowalski, Turner. Each loss carved something essential away from the squadron. Not just numbers on a roster, but trust, belief, the fragile illusion that skill and courage might actually keep you alive. Boyington's drinking spiraled out of control. He'd disappear after debriefs, vanish into the night while pilots sat in silence, replaying the day's failures. Hours later, he'd stumble back with bruised knuckles, torn uniform, no explanation. Just the smell of whiskey and violence. One night, he punched a logistics officer who questioned his judgment in front of the squadron. Broke the man's nose, had to be pulled off by 3 Marines. Another night, he didn't return at all. They found him at dawn, passed out in a supply truck surrounded by empty bottles. Trust, already fragile among men who'd met weeks ago, began to fracture. Whispers in the dark. Doubts spoken only to wingmen. Is Pappy losing it? Can we follow a man who's falling apart? And Rabaul kept coming. Every week, Japanese reinforcements arrived. Troop ships unloading fresh pilots who'd been rotating through since China. More Zeros. More Nakajima Oscars. More Mitsubishi Betty bombers escorted by fighter screens so thick they looked like swarms of insects. Intelligence estimates said the enemy could sustain these losses indefinitely. Endless reserves, endless rotation, endless war. VMF 214 could not. By mid-October, 6 pilots dead in 3 weeks. The math was simple, brutal, undeniable. At this rate, the entire squadron would be wiped out in 30 days. Something had to change. Fast, or the black sheep would become just another footnote, another failed unit chewed up and forgotten in the Pacific's endless hunger. Could a group of strangers learn to fight as brothers before the sky swallowed them whole? Boyington rewrote the playbook because the old one was a death sentence. He gathered them one night after another brutal loss. No tent, no formality. Just 12 exhausted pilots sitting on ammo crates under stars that didn't care whether they lived or died. He drew in the dirt with a stick. First rule, never turn with a 0. The A6M could outmaneuver anything in the sky. Tighter turning radius. Better roll rate at low speed. Lower wing loading that let it pivot like a dancer while the Corsair wallowed like a drunk. Dogfighting it meant committing suicide in slow motion. Instead, boom and zoom. Climb high. Dive fast. One pass, one burst. Then climb again before the 0 could respond. Use altitude like currency, Boyington said. Spend it to gain speed. Trade speed for kills. Never waste either on a turning fight you cannot win. It violated every instinct. Every pilot wanted to turn and fight, prove themselves, win clean. But clean victories were for men who got to go home. The black sheep needed to survive. Second exploit, the Corsairs' one overwhelming advantage: speed. The F4U was a missile and a dive faster than anything Japan had. That speed wasn't just performance, it was armor, it was weapon, it was the difference between life and a smoking hole in the ocean. Hit at 400+ miles per hour. Disengage before the enemy blinks. Reposition at altitude while they're still turning. The 0 couldn't catch what it couldn't see coming. Third attack when the enemy is vulnerable. Japanese fighters were death incarnate in the air. On the ground, warming engines, they were targets. VMF 214 began timing strikes for early morning, catching enemy formations on Rabaul's runways during warm-up before they reached combat altitude, before defensive screens formed. Zeros were helpless at 50 feet with cold engines. The Corsairs' 650 calibers turned them into scrap metal and fire. Boyington brought in Captain Frank Walton, intelligence officer with a gift for patterns. Together they studied everything. Japanese flight schedules pulled from radio intercepts, weather reports, patrol rotation logs captured from downed aircraft, fuel endurance calculations, pilot rest cycles. What looked like chaos had rhythm underneath. Takeoff times clustered around specific hours. Patrol routes followed predictable arcs. Fuel loads limited engagement windows. Find the rhythm, break it, and suddenly the unbeatable enemy had weak points you could drive a Corsair through. Formation flying had to change or they'd keep dying. Most squadrons used finger four patterns, textbook doctrine taught at Pensacola refined over decades. 4 aircraft, rigid spacing, beautiful on paper, suicide under fire. When formations broke, and they always broke, pilots scattered, lost their wingmen, died alone while trying to remember procedures written by men who'd never faced zeros. Boyington simplified everything down to what actually worked. 2-man elements, loose spacing that allowed flexibility. Silent hand signals replaced radio chatter because Japanese interceptors were tracking American frequencies, triangulating positions, vectoring fighters onto talkative pilots. If one pilot saw trouble, his wingman saw his hands and reacted. No words, no delay, no confusion, just instant coordinated response born from trust instead of doctrine. The Corsairs' 650 caliber M2 Brownings delivered 4,800 rounds per minute, combined enough firepower to saw a zero in half. But ammunition was finite. Full combat load, 400 rounds per gun, roughly 35 seconds of continuous fire. Spray and pray meant running dry while enemies kept coming. Boyington taught discipline through brutal repetition. Short bursts, 2 seconds maximum. Aimed at engine cowling or cockpit, the only parts of a zero that mattered. Hit the engine, it dies. Hit the pilot, it dies. Everything else was wasting bullets, precision over fury. Make every round count. Gunnery practice became religious ritual. Every morning, pilots fired at towed sleeve targets over the ocean until trigger discipline was burned into muscle memory. Deflection shooting, lead calculations, closing speed adjustments. The difference between a kill and a miss was often just 2 degrees of aim, and 2 degrees meant the difference between going home or floating face down while sharks circled. They drilled until hands moved without thought, until pulling the trigger for exactly 2 seconds felt as natural as breathing. Tactics became survival. Survival became trust. And trust finally desperately started to weld the black sheep into something stronger than the sum of broken parts. They stopped flying as strangers forced together by bureaucracy, started flying as brothers who knew exactly what the man beside them would do before he did it. By late October, something shifted. VMF 214 wasn't just surviving missions anymore, they were hunting, actively seeking engagement, racking up kills with cold efficiency. The squadron nobody wanted was becoming the unit everyone feared. The misfits were turning into predators. But predators draw attention, and in the vast Pacific theater where every victory was counted and every loss noted, the black sheep were about to discover that reputation cuts both ways. But survival and victory are not the same, and Boyington was about to prove that in the most reckless way possible. In November 1943, Boyington broke orders. The mission brief was explicit: escort bombers to Bougainville, maintain formation. Integrity, stay with the strike package, return on designated flight path. Standard, safe, predictable. Command had been clear. The bombers were the priority. Stick with them. Protect them. No deviations, no heroics, no cowboy nonsense. Boyington acknowledged the briefing, nodded in all the right places, then climbed into his Corsair with absolutely no intention of following orders. At 10,000 feet, he led his flight past the rendezvous point and kept climbing, straight toward Rabaul. His wingmen saw it happening in real time. The angle was wrong. The heading was wrong. They were supposed to be turning southwest toward the bomber stream. Instead, Pappy was climbing northwest directly toward the most heavily defended airspace in the South Pacific. Confusion rippled through the formation. Hand signals flashed, questions on faces behind oxygen masks. What's he doing? Where are we going? But no one questioned Pappy once airborne. That was the unspoken rule. On the ground, you could argue. In the air, you followed, because hesitation killed faster than enemy fire. So they followed. Below them, the Japanese stronghold sprawled across Simpson Harbor like a spreading infection. Runways, revetments, ammunition dumps, fuel storage, and rows upon rows of fighters staged for afternoon patrol, Zeros, Nakajima Oscars, Kawasaki Zeeks. More than 30 aircraft sitting in neat lines, propellers slowly turning as ground crews completed pre-flight checks. Then Boyington did something no American pilot had ever attempted in the entire Pacific War. He switched to the Japanese air control frequency and radioed the enemy in English. His voice crackled across Japanese radios at Rabaul Tower raw, taunting, dripping with contempt, challenging them, mocking them, daring them to come up and fight like men instead of hiding behind their fortress. Some controllers understood English perfectly. They'd studied it, monitored American frequencies. Now an American voice was speaking directly to them on their own channel, an invasion of their airspace that was both literal and psychological. The insult was calculated, deliberate, impossible to ignore. It was reckless, bordering on insane, arrogant beyond measure. Tactically, it made no sense announcing your presence, your position, your intent to the enemy you were about to attack. And it worked perfectly. Because Boyington understood something command didn't. Japanese fighter pilots operated on honor and reputation as much as tactics. A direct challenge delivered with such brazen contempt couldn't be refused, not without losing face, not without admitting cowardice. Zero's scrambled engines, still cold pilots, still strapping harnesses, and climbed into a fight on Boyington's terms. High altitude, American speed advantage, 12 disciplined Corsairs against 30 disorganized Japanese fighters who hadn't finished their pre-flight checks. The black sheep struck like a coordinated pack. They dove in pairs, slashing through the climbing Zeros before the enemy could establish formation or coordination. Boyington's tracers stitched across one Zero's wing route. Metal peeled away. The fighter rolled inverted trailing smoke and fell. His wingman nailed another with a deflection shot. Then another. In 6 minutes of savage combat, VMF 214 knocked down 11 Japanese fighters and scattered the rest back to their revetments. They returned to Turtle Bay victorious and in serious trouble. Marine Command demanded answers. Boyington had abandoned the escort mission, risked his entire flight, violated engagement protocols, and exposed bombers to potential interception. If the gamble had failed, American bombers would have been undefended and his pilots dead for nothing. But it hadn't failed. For the first time, the misfits moved like brothers. The rogue sweep over Rabaul proved something doctrine couldn't teach when led by instinct instead of fear. When freed from rigid procedures that didn't account for actual combat conditions, they were lethal. Still, the moral question lingered in the debriefing tent and in whispered conversations between pilots. Did Boyington break the rules to save lives by destroying enemy fighters before they could intercept? Or did he gamble the squadron's future to quiet the chaos, tearing through his own soul, the drinking, the debts, the ghosts of men he'd lost? Was it tactical brilliance or desperation disguised as leadership? The answer mattered less than the result. VMF 214 had tasted blood. The enemy had felt fear. And Rabaul, the fortress that was supposed to be untouchable, suddenly seemed vulnerable. But the black sheep had also painted a target on themselves. The Japanese wouldn't forget the insult, and payback was coming. But victory always demands payment, and the bill was coming due faster than anyone expected. In January 3, 1944, Boyington led the largest and most dangerous strike of his life. 48 Corsairs, 4 full squadrons, target Rabaul itself, the heart of Japanese air power in the South Pacific. The plan was surgical high-altitude fighter sweep, hit enemy aircraft during rotation change, suppress air cover for an Allied bomber raid scheduled 30 minutes behind them. Maximum aggression. Calculated risk. Everything VMF 214 had learned compressed into one massive coordinated strike. Boyington took point with his wingman, Captain George Ashman. They climbed through thin air at 30,000 feet engines, straining against reduced oxygen propellers, biting into atmosphere that barely existed. Oxygen masks, tight against their faces. Frost forming on canopy edges. Below, the Pacific stretched endless and indifferent blue, turning to black at the horizon. Then the Zeros came. Not in ones or twos like previous engagements, 20 of them rising in a coordinated spiral, cutting off Boyington and Ashman from the main formation. A deliberate intercept, a trap. The rest of VMF 214 was too far ahead, committed to the primary sweep. No time to turn back. Boyington didn't run. He nosed down, accelerating into the swarm. His Corsair shuddered as the airspeed needle climbed past redline 420 miles per hour, then 440. The airframe groaned under stress it wasn't designed to endure. Tracers zipped past his canopy, hot streaks of yellow-orange light that missed by inches. He fired. The first zero exploded in a ball of flame and debris pieces spinning away like shrapnel. The second took concentrated hits across the fuselage, 20mm holes punching through aluminum and peeled off, trailing fire and smoke. The third tried to turn inside him, fatal mistake against a diving Corsair, and Boyington's 650 calibers tore it apart in midair. 3 kills in 30 seconds. In Nado, his 26th, the 27th, and 28th confirmed victories, tying the Marine Corps ace record. But the swarm closed tighter. Ashman's voice crackled over the radio tents, clipped urgent, calling out another group of zeros diving from above at 6 o'clock high. Then Boyington's Corsair lurched violently. Tracers stitched across his right wing. Metal screamed. Holes appeared in the cowling. The R-2800 engine coughed, missed a beat. Coughed again. Smoke poured from the engine compartment, thick, black, choking. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Cylinder head temperature spiked into the red. He was hit. Badly. The Corsair nosed down, no longer by choice, but by gravity and dying thrust. Boyington fought the stick with both hands, trying to level out, but the controls were sluggish, unresponsive. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen. The altimeter unwound 25,000 feet, 20,000, 15,000 hours. Ashman screamed his name over the radio. Once, twice. No response. Boyington's plane spiraled toward the Pacific Ocean, thousands of feet below, trailing black smoke like a funeral banner. The last thing his squadron saw was the white splash, distant final where aircraft met water. Then silence on the radio. Just static and breathing. VMF 214 returned to Turtle Bay without their commander. 47 Corsairs. 1 missing. Victory and disappearance arrived in the same breath. When the best leader you've ever known vanishes into the sea, what's left to fight for? Boyington was gone. No parachute sighting, no radio call, no body recovered, no rescue beacon. Marine Command listed him as missing in action, then after 2 weeks of search operations that found nothing, presumed killed in action. VMF 214 kept flying missions, but the losses piled up faster now. In 6 days after Boyington's disappearance, 6 more black sheep fell. Pilots who'd survived since September, who'd learned Boyington's tactics, trusted his instincts, flown as brothers through hell. Now they flew as ghosts, haunted by an empty cockpit that used to lead them home, making decisions without the one voice they'd learned to trust. Morale collapsed. Pilots questioned orders. Some flew recklessly, as if daring the enemy to finish what Rabaul had started. Others flew too cautiously, second-guessing every decision, freezing at critical moments. By late January, VMF 214 was pulled from frontline rotation. The squadron officially disbanded in February 1944. Its surviving pilots scattered across the Pacific theater, reassigned to other units, other commanders, other wars that didn't understand what they'd been through. They carried with them something unspoken and heavy, the weight of men who'd been part of something rare and couldn't explain it to anyone who hadn't been there. Some requested transfers back together. All were denied. The Black Sheep would never fly as a unit again. But the mission was complete, brutally, expensively complete. In 16 weeks of continuous combat operations, VMF 214 destroyed or damaged 203 Japanese aircraft. Confirmed kills, probable kills. Aircraft destroyed on the ground during the rogue strikes. They shattered Rabaul's air cover, forced enemy redeployments away from critical areas, and cleared the skies over Bougainville long enough for the Marine offensive to take permanent root. The cost was measured in empty chairs and letters home to families who would never fully understand how their sons died. The result was measured in lives saved Marines who landed unopposed because the Zeros were already burning bomber crews who returned safely because enemy interceptors never launched soldiers who advanced through jungle ridges under friendly skies. That was the trade. That was the mathematics of war. And somewhere in the cold Pacific, Gregory Boyington floated alive, badly injured, and unknown to anyone waiting for a Japanese patrol boat to pull him from the water and into 20 months as a prisoner of war in Rabaul, then Truk, then Omori camp near Tokyo. He would survive captivity. He would return home. But VMF 214 would not survive as a unit. The Black Sheep were finished, yet their tactics were only beginning to spread across the Pacific, and their legacy was about to outlive them all. VMF 214's combat record became a tactical blueprint studied across Marine aviation. Command analyzed every mission report, every engagement, every innovation Boyington had improvised under fire. Boom and zoom doctrine, altitude discipline, two-man loose-deuce elements, aggressive early morning strikes against enemy airfields, silent hand signal communication. What started as desperate improvisation by misfits became standard operating procedure. By mid-1944, similar formations and tactics appeared across Palelu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Marine squadrons abandoned rigid finger-four formations in favor of flexible pairs. Corsair pilots trained specifically on high-speed diving attacks instead of turning dogfights. The lessons written in Black Sheep blood became doctrine written in training manuals. The F4U Corsair itself was vindicated completely. Once dismissed by the Navy as too dangerous for carrier operations, it became the dominant fighter of the Pacific theater. Its speed and firepower, the very traits Boyington had weaponized against Japanese agility, made it indispensable. Production ramped up. Navy squadrons grudgingly adopted it. By war's end, F4U Corsairs claimed an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft across all theaters. Boyington's survival stunned everyone. In August 1945, he emerged from Omori prison camp near Tokyo gaunt-weathered, carrying 20 months of captivity in his eyes. The Marine Corps awarded him the Medal of Honor for the January 3rd mission over Rabaul. His final tally, 28 confirmed kills, making him one of the top Marine aces of World War II. But the medal felt hollow to him. 6 Black Sheep never came home from those final weeks. Their names appeared on no headlines. Their families received folded flags and brief letters written by chaplains who'd never met them. Boyington spoke about them often in later years, more than he spoke about his own victories, more than he spoke about the medal. The squadron's organizational model, small, flexible, adaptive, led by decentralized decision-making rather than rigid hierarchy, influenced post-war American fighter tactics profoundly. Korea, Vietnam. Modern carrier air wings still echo the lessons learned in blood over Rabaul. Trust your wingman, absolutely exploit your platform's technical strengths, and never fight the enemy's fight on their terms. VMF 214 became legend in American military culture. Books, films, television series. But legends simplify. They sand down the rough edges. They make heroes clean and victories certain. The real story was darker, harder, more human. 12 men, then 24, then none, burning out fast and bright because that was the only way to survive long enough to matter in a war that consumed everything. They didn't conquer the sky. They learned to respect it. And in doing so, they proved that warfare's turning points often belong not to the perfect units with flawless records, but to the flawed ones who refuse to quit even when quitting makes sense. But what does it mean when history remembers victories and forgets the men who paid for them? In those wide Pacific skies, courage came not from perfect pilots, but from fractured men who chose to fly anyway. They were misfits, outcasts, rejects from other squadrons. The pilots nobody wanted, flying machines the Navy had rejected, led by a commander whose personal demons were as dangerous as any Zero. They drank too much, fought too hard, trusted a leader who was falling apart even as he held them together through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. But when the Zeros came, they didn't hesitate. History remembers VMF 214 for 203 kills, for the legend of the Black Sheep, for Boyington's Medal of Honor and the documentary glory that followed decades later, for the television series that turned them into entertainment. The pilots themselves remembered something else entirely. They remembered the weight of a parachute harness cutting into shoulders during 6-hour missions, the smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with sweat and fear, the silence after a radio call that never got answered, the way a man's voice changed higher, tighter the first time he saw a friend's plane tumble toward the ocean trailing fire. They remembered that every victory was also a funeral deferred. War doesn't care about fairness or justice. It doesn't pause for doubt or forgive mistakes or reward good intentions. It simply takes life's innocence, the comfortable illusion that skill alone can save you, and leaves behind only the question of whether the cost was worth what was won. VMF 214 never answered that question. They just flew the next mission, and the next, until there were no more missions to fly. And maybe that's the real lesson, not that heroes are fearless, but that they fly anyway, knowing full well the sky doesn't promise anything except altitude and consequence. In the end, the Black Sheep didn't change the Pacific Air War because they were extraordinary. They changed it because they were human, flawed, desperate, scared, angry, loyal, and clinging to hope in a metal cockpit over an indifferent ocean that claimed more pilots than enemy bullets ever did. And humanity, imperfect, fractured, but refusing to surrender, has always been the most dangerous force in history. Not because it cannot be broken, but because even broken, it keeps fighting. The sky remembers them still. Not as legends carved in marble, but as men who understood that survival was never guaranteed. Only the choice to try was theirs to make. And they made it. Every single time.